The flight attendant smirked as she dragged the frail old man down the aisle, ignoring his quiet protests. She thought he was just another nobody, but in a few hours when the plane landed, she would realize the shocking truth. She had just humiliated the most powerful man on board, and there was no escaping what was coming next. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. The airport was busy that evening, filled with travelers rushing to catch their flights. Among them was an old man named Alfred Whitmore, his frail body wrapped in a worn-out overcoat. He moved slowly, his steps unsteady, as he clutched a small leather briefcase in one hand. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and deep lines on his face told the story of a man who had seen many years. The airline staff barely noticed him as he shuffled toward the boarding gate, blending into the crowd of tired passengers. As he approached the check-in counter, he offered a polite smile to the flight attendant scanning boarding passes. She barely looked at him, her expression impatient. "Passport and boarding pass," she said quickly, not bothering to make eye contact. Alfred nodded and handed them over with a slight tremor in his fingers. She scanned the documents and sighed, already sounding frustrated. "You're in economy," she muttered, handing them back without another word. Alfred moved toward the boarding area, taking careful steps down the jet bridge. The line was long, and passengers were eager to find their seats. A woman in front of him, Maria, struggled to lift her carry-on bag into the overhead compartment. Without hesitation, Alfred reached out to help, steadying the suitcase and pushing it into place. Maria smiled, thanking him softly before taking her seat. A flight attendant, Vanessa Cole, stood a few rows ahead, adjusting pillows in first class. Her uniform was crisp, her posture firm, and her eyes sharp as she scanned the passengers entering the plane. When she noticed Alfred stepping inside, her brows furrowed slightly. Something about his slow, deliberate movements seemed to bother her. She turned her attention back to adjusting the seats, shaking her head as if dismissing a thought. Alfred walked carefully down the aisle, glancing at his seat number. A young couple, Jason and Lily, rushed past him, nearly knocking him off balance in their hurry. He stumbled slightly but caught himself, gripping the armrest of a nearby seat for support. The movement didn't go unnoticed. Vanessa, who had watched him earlier, now approached with quick, purposeful steps. "Sir, you need to keep moving," she said, her tone firm. Alfred nodded apologetically and continued forward, but his slow pace seemed to test her patience. As he reached his row, he tried to lift his briefcase into the overhead bin. His hands shook slightly as he struggled to push it up. Vanessa sighed loudly, stepping forward and grabbing the case from his hands. "You should have checked this in," she muttered under her breath, shoving it into the compartment before slamming it shut. Alfred didn't complain. He simply nodded and lowered himself into his seat, his breathing slightly heavier from the effort. He folded his hands in his lap and stared out the window, his expression unreadable. Passengers around him settled in, fastening their seatbelts and preparing for the flight. The engines rumbled, and the plane began to taxi toward the runway. Vanessa glanced in his direction one last time, her lips pressing into a thin line. Something about him irritated her, though she couldn't quite say why. As the plane lifted off the ground, Alfred closed his eyes for a moment, his fingers brushing over the surface of his briefcase. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed the small, knowing smile that flickered across his face before vanishing just as quickly. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane climbed higher into the sky. Passengers around Alfred settled into their seats, adjusting pillows and scrolling through in-flight entertainment screens. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a soft glow over the passengers. Alfred remained quiet, his eyes gazing out the window at the vast stretch of clouds beneath him. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of his briefcase, the leather worn from years of use. Vanessa moved swiftly down the aisle, checking seat belts and securing meal carts. Her sharp eyes darted from passenger to passenger, ensuring everything was in order. When she reached Alfred's row, she paused, her irritation from earlier still lingering. She looked down at him, noting his frail frame, the slow way he turned his head when she approached. "Sir, do you need anything?" she asked, but there was no warmth in her tone. It was more of a formality than genuine concern. Alfred glanced up at her, his blue eyes calm. "No, thank you," he said, his voice steady but quiet. Vanessa gave a quick nod and moved on, dismissing him as just another elderly passenger who would likely need extra assistance later in the flight. She preferred efficiency, and passengers who moved too slowly or needed special attention disrupted that. A few rows ahead, a young flight attendant named Leo was assisting an elderly woman with her blanket. His manner was patient, his voice kind. He glanced toward Alfred, noticing how Vanessa had interacted with him. Something about her attitude didn't sit right with him, but he chose to stay silent for now. Meal service began, and trays were handed out one by one, the air filled with the scent of warm food as passengers unwrapped their dinners. Alfred watched as the cart neared his row, his stomach quietly reminding him that it had been hours since his last meal. When Vanessa reached his seat, she hesitated, glancing at the meal list. "You didn't pre-select a meal, sir," she said, her voice clipped. Alfred furrowed his brow slightly. "I believe I did," he responded, his voice polite but firm. Vanessa sighed, clearly annoyed. "Well, there's nothing listed here, and we only have enough for those who reserved in advance." A passenger across the aisle, a businessman named Daniel, looked up from his tray. He had noticed Vanessa's dismissive tone earlier and now watched with mild curiosity. Alfred simply nodded and leaned back in his seat, saying nothing more. A moment later, Leo approached, noticing the interaction. "We have an extra meal in the galley," he offered, already reaching for a tray. Before he could hand it to Alfred, Vanessa stopped him with a slight shake of her head. "He didn't pre-order. We have procedures, Leo." Leo hesitated, looking between Vanessa and Alfred. "It's just an extra meal. He should eat." Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not how it works," she said before pushing the cart forward without another word. Alfred remained still, his face unreadable. The businessman across the aisle shook his head slightly, muttering under his breath. The tension lingered for a few moments before passengers returned to their meals. Leo glanced at Alfred, an apologetic look in his eyes. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I'll see if I can find something for you, sir." Alfred nodded but said nothing. His gaze returned to the window, his fingers gently tapping against the leather of his briefcase. Vanessa continued her rounds, satisfied that she had upheld the airline's rules. She didn't notice the glances exchanged between the passengers who had witnessed what had just happened. She didn't see the way Alfred's expression had barely changed, how his calmness wasn't that of someone defeated, but of someone waiting. The meal service continued, trays being collected as passengers finished eating. The scent of warm food faded, replaced by the faint hum of the aircraft. Alfred remained still, his hands resting on the armrests, his gaze locked on the clouds outside. He hadn't spoken another word since the brief exchange with Vanessa. If he felt insulted, he didn't show it. But others had noticed. Daniel, the businessman across the aisle, leaned slightly toward Alfred. "That wasn't right," he muttered under his breath. "You paid for this flight like everyone else." Alfred turned his head slowly, offering a small nod. "People reveal themselves when they think no one important is watching," he said quietly. His voice carried no anger, just a simple truth. Leo returned a few moments later, carrying a small wrapped sandwich from the galley. He bent down, speaking in a hushed tone. "I managed to grab this, sir. It's not much, but—" Before Alfred could respond, Vanessa appeared beside them. Her sharp eyes flicked to the sandwich in Leo's hands, and she immediately snatched it away. "Leo," she said firmly, her voice low but full of authority, "we don't make exceptions. If we start bending the rules for one person, we'll have to do it for everyone." Leo clenched his jaw but said nothing. Vanessa turned her gaze to Alfred, her voice more clipped than before. "Sir, I understand that you may need special accommodations, but we have guidelines in place for a reason. Next time, I suggest you arrange for proper meal selection ahead of time." Alfred held her gaze, his expression unreadable. Then with a slow nod, he responded, "I'll remember that." Something about the way he said it made Vanessa shift uncomfortably, but she quickly brushed off the feeling and walked away, placing the sandwich back in the service cart. The businessman across the aisle exhaled sharply. "Unbelievable." Other passengers nearby had noticed the interaction as well, their quiet murmurs filling the cabin. A woman seated behind Alfred leaned toward her husband. "Did you see that? They wouldn't even let him have a simple sandwich." Her husband shook his head. What's the harm in giving an old man a meal? The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The incident had been small, but it left an uneasy feeling lingering in the air. Passengers who had previously been lost in their own worlds were now paying closer attention. Alfred, however, remained calm. His fingers once again brushed over the surface of his briefcase. He wasn't upset. He wasn't defeated. He was waiting. Meanwhile, in the galley, Vanessa stored away the last of the meal trays. Leo stood beside her, his arms crossed, his displeasure clear on his face. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Vanessa barely spared him a glance. "I was following protocol," Leo scoffed. "You were being unnecessarily cruel." Vanessa turned sharply, lowering her voice. "I don't make the rules, Leo. He should have planned ahead." Leo's jaw tightened. "Or maybe you just don't like the way he looks." Vanessa stiffened, her fingers tightening around the edge of the service card. She didn't respond, but the flash of irritation in her eyes said enough. She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Leo standing there, watching her retreating figure. The flight continued smoothly, but something was different. A shift had occurred. The passengers were watching, observing every action, every exchange, and Alfred, the frail old man who had been dismissed and ignored, simply sat there, waiting. The cabin had settled into a quiet lull, with passengers either napping, reading, or staring at their screens. The overhead lights were dimmed, casting a soft glow across the rows of seats. The hum of the engines was steady, filling the silence. Yet beneath the stillness, there was an unspoken tension. A few passengers exchanged glances, their minds still on what had happened earlier. Alfred remained in his seat, his posture relaxed but his mind sharp. His fingers slowly traced the worn edges of his briefcase, the only sign that his thoughts were still active. He was in no rush. He had spent a lifetime watching people, studying them, knowing exactly when to act and when to remain still. A few rows ahead, Vanessa moved methodically through the aisle, checking that everything was in order. She enjoyed these moments, the sense of control she had over the cabin. Her authority was unquestioned, at least that's what she thought. As she passed by first class, she greeted a group of well-dressed travelers with a warm smile, her demeanor completely different from how she had treated Alfred. One of the passengers, a man in a tailored suit named Richard, gave her a polite nod before returning to his conversation with a colleague. Meanwhile, back in economy, Alfred reached for his bottle of water. The plastic cap was tightly sealed, and his hands, though steady, lacked the strength they once had. He twisted it carefully, but it refused to budge. Across the aisle, Daniel noticed and leaned over. "Here, let me help," Daniel said, reaching out. Alfred handed the bottle over with a small nod of thanks. Just as Daniel was about to open it, Vanessa's sharp voice cut through the moment. "Sir, please remain in your seat and avoid unnecessary movement." Daniel looked up, surprised by the sudden command. "I was just helping him with his water bottle." Vanessa's eyes flicked between him and Alfred. "If he needs assistance, he should have asked a crew member," she replied, her tone cold. Daniel's jaw tensed. "Is that so?" He twisted off the cap with ease and handed the bottle back to Alfred. "Well, now he doesn't need your help." Alfred took the bottle, his grip firm. His eyes met Vanessa's for a brief moment before he turned away, taking a slow sip of water. Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line. "Just remember, sir, there are rules on this flight for a reason." Daniel leaned back in his seat, shaking his head. "And some people seem to think they're in charge of more than just rules." Vanessa chose to ignore him and continued walking down the aisle, though the conversation had not gone unnoticed. More passengers had begun to whisper among themselves, their quiet voices carrying the weight of discontent. A few moments later, Vanessa returned to the galley, adjusting her uniform as she pulled out the passenger manifest. Her eyes skimmed over the names, stopping on Alfred Whitmore. Something about the name lingered in her mind, but she brushed it off. He was just another economy passenger, one of hundreds she had served over the years. Leo stood nearby, arms crossed. He had witnessed the exchange between her and Daniel, and his patience was wearing thin. "Do you even hear yourself?" he asked, shaking his head. Vanessa exhaled sharply. "Leo, if you have something to say it." He stepped closer. "You treat people differently based on what you assume about them. First class gets smiles and perfect service, and economy gets whatever patience you have left. Vanessa smirked, but her irritation was evident. That's called efficiency. If you're too soft, passengers take advantage of you. Leo's voice was quieter now but firm. Or maybe you're just afraid to treat everyone with the same respect. Vanessa rolled her eyes, brushing past him. Get back to work. Leo watched her walk away, shaking his head. He had a feeling she was going to regret this flight, but it wasn't his battle to fight. Back in his seat, Alfred remained quiet, his expression unreadable. His patience was endless, but it wasn't infinite. He knew people like Vanessa. He had encountered them all his life. And soon she would realize exactly who she had been dealing with. For now he waited. The soft hum of the aircraft filled the cabin as passengers settled in for the long flight. Some had reclined their seats, drifting into light sleep, while others scrolled through their screens, trying to pass the time. But for a handful of passengers, there was an unshakable tension in the air. The way Vanessa had treated Alfred had not gone unnoticed, and while no one wanted to cause a scene, quiet murmurs had started to spread. Alfred sat still, his gaze on the window, watching the endless stretch of clouds below. His face was calm, unreadable, but his mind was far from quiet. He had spent decades in meetings where people underestimated him, dismissed him, assumed they had the upper hand. He knew when to let things play out, when to observe, and when to make his move. A sudden jolt shook the plane, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some mild turbulence. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. Vanessa moved swiftly down the aisle, making sure passengers complied. As she passed by Alfred's row, she barely glanced at him, too focused on maintaining order. A few seats ahead, an elderly woman named Evelyn struggled with her seatbelt, her frail hands unable to pull it tight enough. She turned to the man beside her for help, but before he could assist, Vanessa stepped in. "Ma'am, if you need help, please call a flight attendant," she said quickly, brushing past before waiting for an answer. The man, irritated, leaned in anyway and fastened the seatbelt for Evelyn. She gave him a grateful nod, ignoring Vanessa's dismissiveness. At that moment, another jolt sent a ripple through the plane, and Alfred, who had been reaching for his briefcase, lost his balance slightly. His hand caught the armrest of the seat in front of him as he steadied himself. Vanessa, noticing the movement, turned abruptly. "Sir, I need you to remain seated and stop grabbing onto other passengers," she said sharply. Alfred turned his head slowly, his calm eyes meeting hers. "I was just steadying myself," he said, his voice level. Vanessa crossed her arms. "If you can't manage to keep yourself balanced, you should have requested assistance before boarding," she replied, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Several heads turned at that. Daniel, the businessman across the aisle, let out a quiet scoff. Evelyn frowned, shaking her head. Even Leo, who had been standing near the galley, looked ready to intervene. Alfred didn't respond immediately. He simply held Vanessa's gaze, unblinking. There was something in his expression that made her uneasy, though she wouldn't admit it. "Is there a problem here?" A voice suddenly spoke up. It was Daniel. He wasn't looking at Vanessa. He was looking at Alfred, offering silent support. Vanessa straightened her posture. "No problem," she said curtly. "I'm just making sure everything is in order." Daniel's expression darkened. Funny how that only seems to apply to some passengers. Vanessa ignored him and turned away, moving quickly down the aisle as if to shake off the moment. Leo approached Alfred, his voice low. "Are you all right, sir?" Alfred nodded once. "I'm fine, thank you." Leo hesitated before speaking again. "If you need anything, just let me know." Alfred gave a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I appreciate that." Leo turned back toward the galley, but as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this situation was far from over. Vanessa, meanwhile, had returned to first class, where she moved with a completely different demeanor, smiling, offering extra pillows, ensuring drinks were refilled. The stark contrast in her behavior didn't go unnoticed by the economy passengers who had witnessed her earlier actions. Back in his seat, Alfred reached for his briefcase once again, this time opening it slightly. His fingers grazed over the stack of documents inside, his mind calculating. It wasn't time yet, but it would be soon. The turbulence passed and the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. Passengers resumed their activities, but the tension still lingered. A few exchanged glances, whispering about what had just happened. Vanessa moved through first class with ease, offering an extra layer of hospitality that sharply contrasted with her attitude in economy. It was clear where her priorities lay. Alfred remained still, his hands resting lightly on his briefcase, his expression unreadable. He had never been the type to demand recognition or privilege, but he had also never tolerated disrespect. He watched Vanessa from the corner of his eye as she continued her work, oblivious to the storm she had unknowingly set in motion. A chime from the intercom broke the silence. "Flight attendants, please prepare for mid-flight service." Leo emerged from the galley with a beverage cart, pushing it carefully down the aisle. When he reached Alfred's row, he hesitated for a brief moment before offering a polite smile. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" Alfred looked up, his eyes thoughtful. "Just some tea, please." Leo nodded, pouring a cup and handing it over with care. "Let me know if you need anything else." Before Alfred could respond, Vanessa appeared behind Leo, her presence sharp like a blade. "Keep moving," she instructed, nudging the cart forward. Leo frowned slightly but complied, pushing the cart to the next row. Vanessa turned back to Alfred, her expression neutral, but her tone clipped. "I hope you're comfortable now, sir." There was something in her voice, an air of sarcasm hidden beneath false politeness. She had no idea who she was speaking to, no idea that her career was hanging by a thread she couldn't even see. Alfred studied her for a long moment before speaking. "It's been an interesting flight," he said, his voice calm as ever. Vanessa's lips pressed together. "I'm sure," she said curtly before walking away. A few seats away, Daniel watched the exchange closely. He had been in business long enough to recognize power when he saw it, and something about Alfred's composed demeanor told him there was more to the old man than met the eye. Evelyn, the elderly woman who had struggled with her seatbelt earlier, leaned toward her husband. "That woman doesn't realize she's messing with the wrong person," she whispered. Her husband gave a small nod. "Something tells me she's about to find out." Vanessa continued about her duties, oblivious to the way passengers were beginning to turn against her. The whispers had grown, the disapproving looks more frequent, but she dismissed it all. She had been on dozens of flights, had dealt with countless passengers. To her, Alfred was just another frail old man who would forget about this by the time they landed. But Alfred hadn't forgotten. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out his phone. With steady hands, he typed out a brief message. It was only a few words, but it was enough to set things in motion. A moment later, his phone vibrated with a reply. "Understood. We'll be ready upon landing." Alfred placed the phone back into his briefcase and closed it softly. The flight continued, but for Vanessa, the real turbulence was yet to come. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin as the hours passed. Some passengers had dozed off while others sat quietly, lost in their thoughts or watching the in-flight entertainment. The tension that had been building since takeoff had not disappeared. If anything, it had become stronger. The whispers had spread, and now more and more passengers were aware of what had happened between Vanessa and Alfred. Daniel, still keeping a close eye on the old man, leaned back in his seat, his fingers tapping on the armrest. He had worked in corporate circles long enough to recognize when someone was being underestimated, and something told him that Alfred Whitmore was not an ordinary passenger. The way he carried himself, the way he responded with calmness instead of frustration, it was all too familiar. It was the confidence of someone who knew their power but didn't need to flaunt it. Alfred sat quietly, his hands folded over his briefcase, his expression neutral. But his mind was sharp, calculating every detail. He had already sent his message. Now, all he had to do was wait. Meanwhile, Vanessa moved efficiently through the first-class cabin, offering warm smiles and top-tier service. She made sure drinks were topped up, seats were adjusted properly, and requests were fulfilled without hesitation. The difference between how she treated the front of the plane and the back was stark, and now too many passengers had noticed. As she walked past Daniel's row, he spoke up. "You seem very dedicated to making first class comfortable," he said casually. "What about the rest of the plane?" Vanessa glanced at him, offering a tight-lipped smile. "Every passenger receives the service they're entitled to, sir." Daniel raised an eyebrow. Is that so? He gestured toward Alfred. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like some passengers are treated with a little less respect than others. Vanessa's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she quickly regained her composure. I assure you, sir, I follow standard procedure with all passengers. Daniel let out a quiet chuckle. Standard procedure. Right. He shook his head, turning away. Let's see how that holds up in a few hours. Vanessa narrowed her eyes slightly, unsure of what he meant. But before she could dwell on it, a call light dinged from the first-class section, pulling her attention away. Back in economy, Leo approached Alfred again, crouching slightly beside his seat so that their conversation wouldn't draw attention. I don't mean to pry, Leo said carefully, but something tells me you're not just another passenger. Alfred turned his head toward the young flight attendant, his eyes filled with quiet amusement. And what makes you think that? Leo hesitated, glancing toward the front of the plane. Because I've seen people like you before. You don't react the way most people would. You're too patient. He paused. And I saw you send a message earlier. Alfred didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up his cup of tea, took a slow sip, then set it back down. I appreciate your kindness, Leo, he said after a moment. It's rare to see someone in your position who still values fairness. Leo lowered his voice. She's been treating you terribly, and you know it. And I have a feeling she's going to regret that. Alfred smiled slightly, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. We all face the consequences of our choices eventually. Leo stared at him for a moment before giving a small nod. He wasn't sure what was about to happen, but he knew Vanessa was in for something she wouldn't see coming. As Leo returned to his duties, Alfred reached for his phone again, checking the time. They would be landing in a few hours. That was enough time to let things unfold naturally. Vanessa, completely unaware of the undercurrents shifting around her, continued her rounds. She had convinced herself that whatever complaints the passengers had would fade by the time they reached their destination. After all, people love to grumble during flights, but very few ever followed through with any real action. She had no idea that Alfred had already set everything in motion. The plane continued forward, cutting through the darkening sky. But for Vanessa, the real descent hadn't even begun. The dim glow of the cabin lights cast long shadows across the rows of passengers. The hum of the aircraft was steady, a rhythmic reminder of how much time had passed since takeoff. Outside the window, the sky had turned dark, speckled with distant stars. Most passengers were either asleep or lost in their own thoughts. But the air inside the plane felt different now, charged with an unspoken energy, as if something inevitable was approaching. Alfred remained seated, his posture relaxed, but his mind as sharp as ever. His fingers gently traced the leather of his briefcase, the very object that held the key to everything Vanessa had been so quick to dismiss. He had seen arrogance before, had dealt with people like her more times than he could count. People who believed power was about enforcing rules, about control, about reminding others where they stood. But real power, the kind Vanessa had failed to recognize, wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was quiet, patient, and precise. Vanessa walked through the aisle, her polished shoes making soft clicks against the floor. She had convinced herself that the flight was going smoothly. The turbulence had passed, first class was satisfied, and whatever irritation had built up in economy would disappear the moment the passengers stepped off the plane. Complaints were just that. Complaints. They rarely amounted to anything, but the murmurs hadn't stopped. They had only grown quieter, more deliberate. Passengers weren't forgetting, they were waiting. At the front of the plane, Richard, the businessman from first class, checked his phone. A notification had popped up, an internal memo from the airline's executive team. His eyes flicked toward the economy section, settling briefly on Alfred. He exhaled slowly, slipping his phone back into his jacket pocket. Vanessa made her way toward the galley, her mind focused on completing the final rounds before landing. Leo stood inside, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. She barely spared him a glance. "Are the landing forms ready?" she asked, rifling through a stack of papers. Leo didn't move. "Vanessa." Something in his tone made her pause. She looked up, frowning. "What?" He hesitated as if deciding whether to say what was on his mind. Finally, he exhaled. "You should be careful how you treat people." Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Oh, not this again." She closed the folder in front of her and turned to face him fully. "Look, Leo, I know you like to act like the good guy, but this is a job. I follow rules. If people don't like it, that's not my problem." Leo studied her carefully. "You really don't see it, do you?" She let out a frustrated sigh. "See what?" "The way people are looking at you now," he said simply. "They're not just annoyed. They're waiting for something. And I have a feeling they're going to get it." Vanessa scoffed, shaking her head. "You're being dramatic. I've been on 100 flights like this. People complain, and then they move on. It's part of the job." Leo didn't argue. He just watched her, the way someone watches a person walking toward the edge of a cliff, knowing they won't believe they're in danger until it's too late. Vanessa grabbed the stack of landing forms and turned to leave. "Do your job, Leo." He didn't stop her. He knew she wouldn't listen. Back in his seat, Alfred reached into his pocket and checked his phone once more. A new message had appeared. "Confirmation received. Everything is in place." His lips curled into the faintest smile. The passengers around him had no idea what was coming, but soon they would. And as for Vanessa, she was about to learn a lesson she would never forget. The final stretch of the flight had begun, but for her, the real turbulence was still ahead. The cabin had settled into a strange quiet, the kind that came when anticipation hung heavy in the air. Most passengers were awake now, shifting in their seats, stretching stiff legs, preparing for the descent. The overhead signs flickered on, reminding everyone to fasten their seatbelts. But the routine announcement, the familiar end-of-flight checklist, felt different this time. There was something beneath the surface, an unspoken tension woven between the rows of passengers. Those who had witnessed Vanessa's treatment of Alfred were no longer just spectators. They had watched, whispered, exchanged looks of quiet disapproval, and now they were waiting. Alfred, as always, remained composed. His hands rested lightly on his briefcase, his eyes calm. He had not spoken much, but he had said enough. His silence had done more than words ever could. He wasn't in a hurry, and that was what made all the difference. A few rows away, Daniel checked his watch, his patience thinning. He was a man used to reading boardrooms, understanding power plays, recognizing when someone was about to regret a mistake. He had noticed Alfred from the beginning, not because of his frailty, but because of the way he carried himself. There was something in his stillness, something in his patience. It wasn't weakness, it was control. Vanessa moved through the aisle, ensuring that everything was in order before landing. She felt the eyes on her. Passengers who had been quiet earlier were now watching her too closely. It made her uneasy, though she wouldn't admit it. She stopped at Alfred's row. "Seatbelt, sir," she said, her tone clipped. Alfred met her gaze. He had already fastened it. She hesitated, then quickly moved on. The descent began, the plane dipping slightly as it prepared for landing. Outside, the city lights flickered in the distance, a reminder that the journey was coming to an end. But for Vanessa, something was unraveling. In the galley, Leo stood by the intercom, his fingers drumming against the metal counter. He had a sinking feeling in his gut, an understanding that whatever was about to happen, Vanessa wouldn't see it coming. A sudden ding from the overhead speakers signaled another announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." Vanessa exhaled, relieved that the flight was almost over. She could put this nonsense behind her, return to her routine, and let passengers like Alfred fade into memory. Then the unexpected happened. The cockpit door clicked open, and the captain himself stepped into the cabin. A tall, authoritative man with a sharp gaze. He rarely left the controls unless absolutely necessary. The passengers turned, some shifting in their seats, others murmuring under their breath. Even Vanessa looked surprised. The captain cleared his throat, his voice calm but firm. "Mr. Whitmore." Alfred slowly lifted his head, his expression as composed as ever. "We've been notified of your presence on this flight, sir," the captain continued. "On behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced." Silence. A heavy, weighty silence that settled over the cabin like a dense fog. Passengers froze. their eyes darting between Alfred and the captain, trying to understand what they had just heard. Vanessa stiffened. She barely processed the words at first. "Mr. Whitmore?" She turned toward Alfred, her breath catching in her throat. No, that couldn't be right. He was just an old man, just a slow-moving, ordinary economy passenger. Except he wasn't. The realization hit her like a cold wave. Alfred Whitmore. Not just a passenger, not just another elderly traveler struggling to find a seat. Alfred Whitmore, the primary shareholder of the airline, the man who owned more of the company than anyone else, the man she had ignored, dismissed, humiliated in front of an entire cabin full of people. Her chest tightened. A ripple of whispers spread through the cabin like wildfire. Passengers turned to one another, muttering in hushed voices, eyes widening as they processed the revelation. Daniel smirked, shaking his head. "Knew it," he muttered under his breath. Evelyn clutched her husband's arm. She had no idea. Leo inhaled sharply, glancing toward Vanessa, waiting for her reaction. And Vanessa was frozen. The captain continued speaking, unaware of the way she had turned pale, how she had suddenly gripped the service card as if it was the only thing keeping her standing. "We've already contacted our executive team, sir," the captain said respectfully. "They will be waiting upon landing to discuss any concerns you may have." Alfred, calm as ever, gave a slow nod. "I appreciate that." The passengers were no longer just watching. They were witnessing. Witnessing the moment Vanessa's world crumbled. Her throat felt dry. She could feel every pair of eyes on her now, not with the quiet submission she had come to expect from economy passengers, but with something else entirely. Judgment. She had spent the entire flight treating him like he was beneath her. Now she had to face the truth. She had humiliated the most powerful man on the plane, and there would be consequences. The plane continued its descent, but for Vanessa it felt like the ground was rushing toward her far too fast. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. The whispers around her had turned into a low hum, like static filling the air, each voice adding another layer to her unraveling reality. Alfred Whitmore. The name rang in her head, over and over, each repetition sinking the truth deeper into her chest. He wasn't just some frail old man struggling with his bag, wasn't just another economy passenger she could dismiss. He owned the very airline she worked for. Her breathing grew shallow as she stood frozen near the galley, gripping the edge of the service cart. Her fingers felt numb. It didn't feel real. Passengers exchanged knowing glances, some shaking their heads, others smirking, as if they had just witnessed a live downfall. They weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting to see what would happen next. Daniel chuckled under his breath, stretching his arms before leaning toward Evelyn across the aisle. "That flight attendant's about to have the worst day of her career," he murmured. Evelyn nodded, her expression unreadable. "She had plenty of chances to do the right thing," she replied. "Now she's going to see what happens when you forget that kindness costs nothing." Leo, standing just behind Vanessa, saw the way her entire posture had stiffened, the way her eyes darted toward the first-class cabin as if looking for an escape. He sighed, shaking his head. "Told you," he muttered, but there was no satisfaction in his voice. Vanessa's legs felt like lead as she forced herself to turn, her heart hammering in her chest. The captain was still standing near Alfred's seat, waiting respectfully as the older man closed his briefcase and adjusted his posture. Every movement was slow, deliberate. Nothing about Alfred's demeanor had changed. He was still calm, still composed, still in complete control. But now everyone else knew it too. Vanessa took a shaky step forward, trying to force a polite smile onto her face, but her lips felt stiff, unwilling to bend. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Alfred lifted a hand, cutting her off with the simplest gesture. She fell silent instantly. "I have nothing to discuss with you," Alfred said smoothly, not even looking at her. His attention remained on the captain. "I will handle the matter with the executive team." Vanessa's stomach twisted painfully. No. That wasn't good. If this was just about a single misunderstanding, she could apologize. If it was just about the meal or the luggage, she could find a way to smooth it over. But he wasn't interested in talking to her. That meant this was bigger than her. The realization made her skin prickle with panic. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Cabin crew, please take your seats for landing." The captain gave Alfred a small nod before heading back toward the cockpit. Vanessa, still standing in the aisle, realized she had no choice but to return to her jump seat. Her movements were stiff, mechanical, as she turned and walked toward the galley, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, each one worse than the last. Leo watched her sit down across from him, her face pale, her eyes staring straight ahead as if willing herself to disappear. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "What are you going to do now?" Vanessa swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Maybe it won't be that bad," she muttered half to herself. Leo exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You think?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her hands clenched into fists in her lap as the plane descended lower and lower. She could see the city lights now, the runway stretching out beneath them. Reality was rushing toward her, unavoidable and merciless. As the plane made its final approach, Vanessa forced herself to breathe, but it felt like she was suffocating, because deep down, she already knew. The moment that plane landed, her life as she knew it was over. The wheels of the plane touched the runway with a soft thud, and the familiar pull of deceleration pressed passengers gently back into their seats. The finality of landing should have been a relief, a signal that the long flight was over. But for Vanessa, it felt like a slow-motion descent into something much worse. Her hands were clammy, her pulse racing as she unbuckled herself from the jump seat. The final announcement crackled through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. We appreciate your cooperation and thank you for flying with us." The cabin filled with the usual shuffle of passengers reaching for their bags, stretching after the long flight, murmuring in tired voices. But beneath the ordinary end-of-flight routine, there was something else. Everyone was still watching. Vanessa stood, smoothing her uniform with stiff fingers. Her heart pounded painfully against her ribs. Maybe, just maybe, if she kept her head down, if she moved fast enough, she could avoid what was coming. But before she could take a step, the cockpit door opened again. The captain walked out with an unreadable expression, followed by another crew member carrying a clipboard. Then she saw them. Two airline executives in dark suits were already inside the jet bridge, waiting just outside the aircraft door. And next to them, security. Vanessa's stomach dropped. Her breath hitched as she stole a glance at Alfred, who remained seated. He had made no move to rush off the plane like the other passengers. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't flustered, because he was the reason they were here. She felt the blood drain from her face. Passengers were beginning to stand, the usual hum of conversation growing louder. But there was an underlying current of energy, like everyone was waiting for something more. Daniel, who had been watching everything unfold from across the aisle, smirked as he pulled his carry-on from the overhead bin. This should be interesting. Evelyn, still seated with her husband, sighed softly. "I'd say I feel bad for her," she murmured, "but I don't." Leo was silent, but his sharp eyes flicked between Vanessa and the group waiting just beyond the door. His hands tightened around the strap of his service bag. Vanessa's breath came shorter now, panic clawing at the edges of her mind. This couldn't be happening. She forced herself to move, stepping toward the front of the plane. But the moment she did, the captain's voice stopped her cold. "Vanessa," he said firmly, his voice low but full of weight. She turned slowly, dread curling in her stomach. "You need to stay on board," he said. "The executive team needs to speak with you before you disembark." Her mouth went dry. Passengers were filing out now, some giving her knowing looks as they passed. Others simply watched from the corners of their eyes. Vanessa looked toward the jet bridge again, where the airline officials and security remained in place. They weren't leaving. They were here for her. The air in the cabin felt too thick, pressing against her chest. She tried to swallow the lump in her throat. "This is just a discussion, right?" she asked, her voice weak, barely above a whisper. The captain didn't answer immediately, and that was answer enough. Vanessa's knees felt weak. Passengers were still moving past her, some whispering, others watching openly. She couldn't escape it. The judgment, the humiliation, the weight of every single thing she had done on this flight crashing down on her. Alfred had not moved, but she could feel his presence like a heavy storm cloud behind her. She turned slightly, just enough to see him sitting there, calm, patient. His fingers brushed over the briefcase in his lap as if he had all the time in the world. Her mouth opened, words of defense, of explanation, of desperation hovering on the edge of her tongue. But she saw the way he looked at her, not with anger, not with gloating satisfaction, just quiet, unwavering certainty. She realized in that moment that he had known this was coming from the start, and she had walked right into it. The last of the passengers had left now, the plane nearly empty except for the crew. The air felt colder, the silence heavier. Leo stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable. The captain nodded toward the exit. "They're waiting for you." Vanessa's feet felt like lead. She forced herself forward, one step, then another, her movements robotic. When she reached the door, she hesitated, her hand gripping the metal edge of the doorway. Outside, the airline officials straightened. Security watched her closely. There was no escaping this. Her career, her reputation, her life as she knew it, everything was about to change, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Alfred remained seated as she stepped onto the jet bridge. Only after she was gone did he finally stand, adjusting his coat, picking up his briefcase. Then, with the same quiet patience he had carried through the entire flight, he walked off the plane. The jet bridge felt colder than the plane, the artificial lights casting a harsh glare on the smooth metal walls. Vanessa's heartbeat pounded in her ears, her legs stiff as she stepped forward. The suit-clad airline executives stood in a rigid line, their faces carefully blank, their expressions giving nothing away. Behind them, two security officers remained still, their presence subtle but undeniable. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but her throat felt tight, her words trapped beneath the crushing weight of what was happening. One of the executives, a tall man with sharp eyes, finally stepped forward. His name tag read Anthony Reed, Senior Operations Director. "Miss Cole," he said, his tone professional but distant, "we need to have a conversation about your conduct on this flight." Vanessa's hands clenched at her sides. "Sir, Anthony held up a hand, stopping her. "Now is not the time to explain yourself. We will conduct a full review, but I suggest you listen carefully before speaking." Her mouth snapped shut. A second executive, a woman with short black hair, pulled out a sleek tablet and swiped at the screen. "We have already received multiple reports regarding the treatment of a particular passenger, Mr. Alfred Whitmore." The name sent another jolt of panic through Vanessa's veins. Passenger complaints, as well as observations from crew members, indicate a pattern of behavior that is both unprofessional and unacceptable. The woman continued. "Failure to provide adequate service, public humiliation of a paying customer, and direct violation of the airline's customer care policies." Vanessa felt her breath catch. I didn't." "Miss Cole," Anthony interjected, his voice firmer. "We have footage." Her stomach dropped. Cameras. Of course. There were cameras in the cabin installed to ensure safety, but also to protect the airline from liability. She had dismissed Alfred so easily, so carelessly, believing that economy passengers rarely had the power to fight back. But Alfred wasn't just another passenger, and now she had nowhere to hide. Anthony's expression hardened. "The footage shows you repeatedly dismissing Mr. Whitmore's reasonable requests, denying him service, and, most notably, physically grabbing his briefcase and removing his meal." "I was following protocol," Vanessa blurted out, her voice cracking. He didn't pre-order a meal. He wasn't listed. And yet," Anthony continued, ignoring her interruption, "when another flight attendant attempted to provide him with an available meal, you personally interfered." Vanessa swallowed. "We also reviewed interactions between you and other passengers," the woman added. "It is clear that there was a difference in your treatment of first-class and economy passengers, specifically in tone, responsiveness, and overall attentiveness." Vanessa's hands trembled. She had never thought about it, never realized how much of her bias was being recorded, how it was now being held up in front of her like a mirror she couldn't turn away from. Anthony took a step closer, his sharp gaze locking onto her. "Miss Cole, I'm going to be very clear with you. This is not just about one passenger. This is about a pattern of behavior that has likely gone unchecked for some time." Vanessa felt her lips part slightly, but no words came. You misjudged someone, he continued, not just in title but in character. Mr. Whitmore did not request special treatment. He did not demand to be acknowledged for his position. But do you know what he did do? Vanessa didn't answer. He let you show exactly who you are, Anthony said coldly. And now, you will answer for it. A sharp gust of air hit her as the jet bridge door opened again. Footsteps. She turned her head slightly, her stomach twisting. Alfred had stepped onto the jet bridge. Passengers moved past him, some whispering, others casting knowing glances. But he paid them no mind. His movements were slow, precise, deliberate, just as they had been for the entire flight. For the first time since stepping off the plane, Vanessa saw him in full. Not just an old man, not just a quiet, unassuming passenger. He walked with purpose, his briefcase still tucked under his arm, his eyes steady and unreadable. The executives turned to him immediately, their expressions shifting into something far more respectful. Mr. Whitmore, Anthony greeted, his voice carrying a weight of authority laced with caution. I apologize on behalf of the airline. We have already begun reviewing the incident and… Alfred lifted a hand slightly and Anthony fell silent. The power shift was undeniable. I trust that you will handle this appropriately, Alfred said, his voice even. He wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive, but there was a quiet steel in his words that made the executives stand straighter, made Vanessa's breath hitch in her throat. Of course, sir, the woman with the tablet assured him. We take these matters very seriously. Alfred nodded, satisfied. Then finally he turned his gaze toward Vanessa. She felt her stomach churn. There was no anger in his expression, no satisfaction in watching her squirm. That made it worse, because he wasn't looking at her as an enemy. He was looking at her as someone who had already lost. Vanessa wanted to speak, wanted to plead, wanted to offer any excuse that would save her. But she knew, deep down, she knew. Nothing she said would matter now. Alfred adjusted the strap of his briefcase. I don't believe in revenge, he said, his voice calm but firm. But I do believe in accountability. The words hit her harder than any punishment they could have written up against her. Anthony turned back to Vanessa, his expression unreadable. Miss Cole, you will be placed on immediate suspension pending further investigation. You are expected to comply fully with the internal review process. Your access to the airline systems and operations will be revoked until a decision is made. Vanessa's breath hitched. Suspension. She opened her mouth, desperate now. Sir, please, But Anthony's sharp look silenced her. This meeting is over, he said. We will be in touch regarding next steps. Vanessa stood frozen, her entire body numb. Passengers continued to file past, some looking back at her one last time before disappearing into the airport terminal. Leo, standing just inside the jet bridge, let out a slow breath before turning and walking away. Daniel passed by, pausing just long enough to shake his head before following the others. Vanessa remained rooted to the spot, feeling as if she were the last one left on the plane. Alfred gave her one final glance before stepping past her, walking toward the terminal without another word. She watched him go, the reality of everything settling in her chest like an unbearable weight. It was over, and there was nothing she could do to change it. Vanessa stood motionless in the jet bridge, her world unraveling around her. The voices of the executives had faded into a dull hum in her mind, drowned out by the pounding of her own heartbeat. She barely felt the stiff airline-issued fabric of her uniform against her skin, barely registered the lingering glances of the passengers who had witnessed her downfall. The reality was settling in. Suspension. Investigation. The possibility, no, the certainty of termination looming over her like a storm cloud she had never seen coming. Her mind raced, searching for a way out. Maybe she could argue her case. Maybe she could claim miscommunication. Maybe this was all an overreaction. But as she looked up, watching Alfred Whitmore disappear into the airport terminal with quiet dignity, she realized the truth. There was no escape from this. She had played her hand and she had lost. Her legs felt weak as she forced herself to move, stepping toward the side of the jet bridge, where she braced herself against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. The executives had already turned away from her, speaking amongst themselves in hushed voices. She was no longer their concern. She was no longer anyone's concern. Just hours ago, she had been in control, moving through the aisles with practiced authority, dismissing passengers like Alfred without a second thought. She had believed herself untouchable. After all, how many flights had she worked where passengers grumbled but did nothing? How many people had she brushed aside, assuming their complaints would disappear into the void of corporate bureaucracy? But Alfred hadn't grumbled. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't demanded immediate justice. He had simply waited, and that had been far more dangerous. She felt the blood drain from her face as she recalled every moment. The sighs of impatience, the refusal to serve him a meal, the way she had taken his bag from his hands with barely concealed irritation. She had treated the owner of the airline like an inconvenience. She had belittled a man who had built the very company she worked for, and now she was paying the price. A sudden burst of movement near the terminal entrance caught her attention, pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. She turned her head and saw a cluster of airline staff gathered around, whispering to one another. Their eyes flickered between Alfred and the executives, confusion and curiosity evident on their faces. The news was spreading. Her humiliation wasn't going to stay confined to this jet bridge. By the end of the day, the entire airline staff would know what had happened. By the end of the week, employees across different bases and regions would be talking about the flight where an attendant dragged an old man down the aisle, only to find out he owned the airline. Her stomach twisted painfully. She could already imagine the whispers in the break rooms, the quiet stares during training sessions, the way her name would be mentioned as a warning, an example of what not to do. Her breath shuddered as she pushed herself off the wall, forcing herself to walk forward. She didn't want to stay here any longer, but just as she reached the end of the jet bridge, one of the executives called her name. "Miss Cole." She stopped, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. Anthony Reed, the senior operations director, studied her with the cold, detached gaze of a man who had delivered more terminations than he cared to count. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Consider yourself fortunate that Mr. Whitmore did not request immediate action beyond a suspension. Had he insisted, you wouldn't even be given a review process." Vanessa felt her throat tighten. Anthony exhaled, glancing down at his tablet. "The final decision will come from corporate, but if I were you, I would start considering other career options." She flinched. The words struck harder than she expected. She wanted to protest, to insist that she could change, that this had been a misunderstanding, but she knew better. Nothing she said now would matter. Anthony turned, speaking quietly with the other executives. Their conversation already moving past her, she had become irrelevant. With shaking hands, she pulled out her phone, her fingers barely able to type as she scrolled through her messages. No new emails, no reassurances, just silence. Her reputation was already beginning to crumble, and soon her employment status would follow. Meanwhile, in the terminal, Alfred walked with steady steps, his expression as unreadable as ever. Passengers who had witnessed everything stood off to the side, some murmuring amongst themselves, others simply watching him leave. Daniel, the businessman, exhaled and gave a small nod, as if confirming something to himself. He had seen power in many forms, but this was the kind that left an impact. Evelyn turned to her husband. "I wonder what happens now," she mused. Her husband adjusted his bag over his shoulder. "Whatever it is, she won't forget it." A few feet away, Leo lingered near the entrance of the terminal, watching Alfred with quiet admiration. He had been the only crew member who had tried to do the right thing, and Alfred had noticed. Alfred paused briefly, turning slightly toward him. Their eyes met. A small nod. Nothing more. But for Leo, it meant everything. Vanessa, still standing in the jet bridge, felt the world closing in on her. Her hands trembled as she clutched her phone, the weight of her actions sinking deeper and deeper. This wasn't just a bad day at work. This was the moment that would define her entire career. And as she watched Alfred disappear into the crowd, she knew there was no undoing what had already been done. Vanessa stood in the jet bridge long after Alfred had disappeared into the terminal. The weight of what had just happened pressed against her chest, heavy and suffocating. Her body refused to move, her mind cycling through every mistake, every moment where she could have acted differently but hadn't. A part of her still wanted to believe this was salvageable. Maybe if she could just explain, if she could make them understand that she had only been following protocol, that she hadn't meant anything personal. But deep down, she knew that was a lie. She hadn't been following protocol. She had been following her own bias, her own impatience, her own judgment of people based on nothing more than what they looked like, how they moved, where they were seated. And the worst part, she had done it without even thinking. Her breathing grew unsteady as she watched the last of the passengers disappear into the terminal. The airport was alive with movement. People rushing to connecting flights, families reuniting, businessmen checking their phones as they walked. Life outside of this flight had moved on, but she hadn't. Her world had just stopped. A lump formed in her throat as she gripped her phone tighter. She scrolled desperately through her messages, but there was nothing. No reassurances from higher-ups. No calls from her supervisor defending her. No one to tell her it would be okay. She wasn't important enough to be defended. Her career was slipping through her fingers, and there was no one coming to save her. Leo walked past, giving her a lingering glance. He didn't say anything, but his silence spoke volumes. She had dismissed his warnings. She had brushed off every chance to treat people with basic respect. And now she was standing here alone, drowning in the consequences. She forced herself to take a step forward, her legs stiff as she entered the terminal. The executive team was still gathered near the exit, deep in conversation. Vanessa considered approaching them, begging them to reconsider. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Alfred hadn't even needed to demand that she be removed. He had simply existed, calm, patient, watching, and that had been enough. She had handed him everything he needed to end her. Her breath hitched as she forced herself to keep walking past the cluster of airline staff who were already whispering about what had happened. They all knew. She spotted a group of flight attendants near the crew lounge, their eyes flickering toward her before quickly turning away, pretending not to notice. But she could feel it, the way her presence carried weight now. Not as an authority figure, as a lesson. She was that flight attendant, the one who had made the mistake so big, so public, that she had turned herself into a cautionary tale overnight. A part of her wanted to turn around, run, escape the humiliation that awaited her the moment she stepped outside this airport. But there was nowhere to run from this. Her career, her reputation, the life she had built in the airline industry, it was all hanging by a thread she could no longer hold on to. She spotted Anthony Reed speaking quietly with another executive, both of them scrolling through their phones. Her stomach twisted. She knew what they were looking at. Corporate had already been informed. By tomorrow, her name would be in meetings. By the end of the week, she'd be summoned for an official review. And after that, she knew the answer. Suspension was just the first step. Termination was next. Her hands trembled as she turned away from them, her vision blurring slightly. She needed air. She needed to breathe. She pushed through the terminal, weaving past travelers, past airport employees who had likely already heard whispers of what had happened. She could feel the stares, could hear the hushed voices behind her. That's her. The one who mistreated the owner of the airline? Yeah, she didn't know who he was. I heard she dragged him down the aisle. The rumors had already begun to morph, growing, twisting. It wouldn't be long before social media picked up on it, before videos from passengers started circulating, before she became a headline. Vanessa clenched her teeth, her breath coming in sharp bursts as she finally reached the airport exit. The automatic doors slid open, letting in the crisp night air, but it did nothing to ease the storm raging inside her. This wasn't just a bad day. It was the end of everything. Her phone vibrated in her hand, and for a split second, hope flickered. Maybe it was someone defending her. Maybe she still had a chance. She looked down. A single email notification glowed on her screen. Subject: urgent, immediate suspension. Notice from Airline Corporate Management. Her fingers hovered over the screen, her breath shaking. She couldn't open it. She already knew what it said. The walls of her world had collapsed, and all she could do was stand there, staring at the glowing letters on her screen, realizing, too late, that she had done this to herself. The city lights blurred in the distance as Vanessa stood outside the airport, her phone still gripped tightly in her trembling hands. The email notification glowed on the screen, taunting her, A single line of text that confirmed what she had already known deep down. This was the end. She could feel the cool night air against her skin, but it did nothing to calm the storm raging inside her. Her breath came in uneven bursts as she tried to gather herself, tried to think of a way to fix this, to turn things around. But there was nothing left to do. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake that could be smoothed over with an apology or an explanation. She had been exposed. And worse, she had done it to herself. Her mind raced through every moment on that flight, replaying the way she had dismissed Alfred without a second thought. The impatience in her tone, the sighs, the irritation, the way she had taken his bag from his hands like he was a burden, how she had denied him something as simple as a meal. She hadn't even hesitated. Not once. She had been so sure of herself, so certain that no one would question her authority, that she could treat people however she wanted as long as she hid behind the excuse of company policy. But now, standing here, isolated and humiliated, she saw it clearly. It had never been about policy. It had been about power, and she had used hers in the worst possible way. Passengers had seen it. Her crew members had seen it. The owner of the airline had seen it. And now everyone else would too. Her phone vibrated again. Another email coming in. She squeezed her eyes shut before looking down. Meeting scheduled for disciplinary review. There it was, the formality before the inevitable termination. A lump formed in her throat. She wanted to throw her phone, to scream, to do something, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. Nothing could change this. From the corner of her eye, she spotted movement near the airport entrance. A small group of flight attendants had gathered there, chatting quietly. One of them glanced in her direction, then another. She didn't have to hear what they were saying to know. She had become the story, the cautionary tale. Vanessa turned away quickly, her pulse hammering. The panic in her chest felt suffocating now, the walls of her career closing in. She had been flying for years, had worked so many flights she had lost count. But never, not once, had she felt smaller than she did at that moment. Her feet felt heavy as she moved toward the airport exit, her body running on instinct. She wasn't sure where she was going. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she was alone. She had spent the entire flight making Alfred feel insignificant, like he was beneath her, like his presence didn't matter. And now she understood what that felt like. Because she wasn't Vanessa Cole, the flight attendant with seniority anymore. She was just a woman with no job, no reputation, and no future in the airline industry. Her career had crashed before the plane even landed. And Alfred? Alfred had walked away from it all with the same quiet dignity he had carried throughout the entire flight. He had never needed to raise his voice. He hadn't demanded revenge. He had simply let her destroy herself. As Vanessa stepped out into the city, swallowed by the dark streets and neon lights, one final crushing thought filled her mind. She had spent years believing that power meant control, but now she knew. True power belonged to those who never needed to prove it. What do you think about this story? Was the flight attendant's fate deserved? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.